How's it going, folks? My name's Des, and this is the brand new Sony A7 IV, and I've been using it for the last week or so for content creation for my main YouTube channel. And in this video, I'm going to give my first impressions of this camera that packs in a lot of features for a pretty reasonable price, especially when you compare it to something like the Sony A7S III. Now, don't get me wrong, the Sony A7S III, this thing is an absolute beast of a camera that can literally do everything I need. But I tell you what, the Sony A7 IV, this thing ticks a lot of check boxes, and I think this could be one of the best all-around cameras for content creators. So I won't necessarily be going over every single difference between these two cameras in this video. I may do like a really deep dive in-depth comparison of these two in the future. This video is more about my overall thoughts on how the Sony A7 IV stacks up against the Sony A7S III from a usability perspective, as well as the features that I care about most with my workflow as a content creator. And I'll try to cover as much as I can in this video, but if there's anything that I don't cover that you'd like to know about, definitely leave a comment down in the comments section down below and I'll do my best to answer that question. And if the information in this video does help you out at all, don't be shy about hitting that like button down below. It's a small little thing that'll help this video and the channel quite a bit, and I appreciate it. So the form factor and controls are nearly the same on these two, but there are some tweaks to the controls on the A7 IV, which I quite like. So the first of which is the mode dial on top. The A7S III has just one dial where you can select between video modes and then the photo modes, all in one dial. With the A7 IV, it has a dedicated photo, video, and S and Q mode sub-dial sort of thing below the main dial, so there's a lot more flexibility here with the modes that you can set up. In essence, almost tripling the modes that you can have, since you can set up custom modes for photo, video, as well as S and Q. And it's actually super fast switching between these modes with this little switch that they have in front, which you can access with your index finger while still holding the camera. There's really no awkward hand placement needed. And then another difference here is with the exposure compensation dial, where that's a dedicated dial on the A7S III, and with the A7 IV, it acts as a third customizable dial. And you'll also notice in the menu that the options are a little bit different here with the dials, where they actually grouped the customization options just a little bit differently. And then another minor difference here is with the new flip out screen on the A7 IV, the notch is actually located at the bottom versus the top on the A7S III. Other than that, it's kind of hard to tell a difference between these two bodies, but overall, I do like the updates to the controls on the A7 IV. I just wish that they would move this menu button to the right-hand side of the device. I mean, does anybody else think that the menu button is in the worst possible location, especially when the screen is open? I don't know, maybe that's just a me thing. And then while we're talking about the menu, it does use the same type of menu configuration / interface as the A7S III, which is so amazingly nice to use compared to their older interface. So I actually use a Sony A7C as my main A cam that's recording me right now, and I was really close to buying another one of those for an overhead rig, but I'm really glad I waited for the A7 IV because the A7C, it uses the older menu system, and although it does have the flip out touchscreen, it doesn't really utilize the touchscreen throughout portions of the menu. And with the A7 IV, it has the most updated menu system as well as a touchscreen that you can use with that menu system. And if you do want to see a comparison of the A7C versus the A7 IV, just let me know down in the comment section down below and I'll see what I can do. And then in terms of video modes, the A7 IV can shoot what I think is a very usable set of options for a content creator. It can shoot high quality 10-bit 422 footage all the way up to 60 frames per second, but just note with that, with the 60p, there is going to be a super 35mm crop. Now, I don't think the crop in 60p is going to be a big deal in most situations, but I already did run into a minor snag, at least with my workflow. So I'll be using the A7 IV as my main overhead camera, and with larger products, well, I actually couldn't fit them completely inside the frame, at least with a 28mm lens. But thankfully, most of the products are smaller products, but for anything larger, I'll have to switch out to something wider than the kit lens that comes with the A7 IV kit. So the lens that comes in the kit is going to be a 28 to 70mm. And then one pretty big difference between the A7S III and the A7 IV is going to be with frame rate. So with the A7S III, you can shoot some super slow-mo 120 frames per second footage in full 4K, which, oh boy, do I love, but you can still shoot 120 frames per second in HD on the A7 IV. And then strangely, on both of these cameras, if you're using the HEVC codec, there's no option for 30p. On the A7S III, there's 60, 24, and 120. And then on the A7 IV, there's 60p and 24p. I find that a little bit strange, and I'm not necessarily sure why. So if anybody knows, please let us all know in the comment section down below. So the processor in the A7 IV is the same Bionz XR processor that's found in the A7S III as well as the Sony A1. So navigating around the menu is super snappy and there's basically no lag at all. The A7 IV also has dual card slots like the A7S III, but the A7 IV only has one slot that can double as both an SD card slot as well as a CF Express slot. And then the sensor is also going to be different on these two, where the A7 IV uses a 33 megapixel sensor and the A7S III uses a 24 megapixel sensor. And the images out of the A7 IV are super crispy for both video and photos. When you have plenty of light, you really can't go wrong with either of these. And obviously with that 33 megapixel sensor, you'll be getting much more detail with your photos. But where this gets interesting though is with low light performance. So we all know that the A7S III is a beast in low light, and the image cleans up a ton when you're going from ISO 10,000 to 12,800, especially using S-Log. So what I found fascinating here is that the low light performance with A7 IV was pretty darn good too, and was more linear than the A7S III, where it didn't degrade at 10,000 ISO like the A7S III does. But then at 12,800, here's where you can see the A7S III clean up a ton. So the noise in the A7 IV was, I think, totally usable, maybe up to about 25,600 or so in this situation at least. And at the really high ISOs, the A7S III definitely was more sensitive, but also somewhat noisy. Oh, and there's also this new focus breathing compensation feature on the A7 IV, which if you're doing some focus pulling, this is just a nice feature to have. I usually have to edit out the breathing in post, but now with the A7 IV, even with fast pulls, I don't notice any breathing. Just note though that the breathing compensation feature isn't available on all lenses. A special note is that it doesn't seem to be available with the 28-70 kit lens that comes with the A7 IV kit, but it was available on the Sony G24-105 f4. So the Sony A7S III is an amazing camera, but quite frankly, it's not cheap, and there are some features that some people just may not utilize. The Sony A7 IV, I think it is a super compelling option for a content creator, and I'm not just talking about video, I'm talking about photo too, since it has that 33 megapixel sensor versus the only 24 megapixels on the A7S III. I think it's kind of hard to go wrong with the A7 IV, and I'm super stoked about this camera. I'll be using it primarily as an overhead camera as well as a backup B-roll camera to my A7S III, and in a couple weeks I'll have a more in-depth long-term review of this camera where I've had the opportunity to test everything in lots of different scenarios, so make sure to subscribe to get a notification when that video comes out. And if the information in this video did help you out at all, don't be shy about hitting that like button down below. Thanks so much for watching, and we will see you in the next video.